The morning sun cast long shadows across Central Park as Officer Robert Wilson began his routine patrol. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he walked the familiar paths he'd traversed countless times before. It was a quiet Thursday morning, with only a few early joggers and people rushing to work crossing his path. Everything seemed normal until he spotted a figure huddled on a weathered wooden bench near the duck pond. Drawing closer, he saw it was an elderly man wrapped in a worn military jacket, fast asleep with a small backpack clutched protectively to his chest. A few neatly arranged possessions lay beside him: a pair of clean but threadbare shoes, some carefully folded blankets, and a plastic folder that appeared to contain photographs. Instead of following standard procedure for handling situations with homeless individuals, something darker stirred in Officer Wilson that morning. Perhaps it was the stress from his recent divorce, or maybe the brewing argument with his supervisor from the day before. Whatever the reason, he chose to let his frustration guide his actions. "Hey, wake up!" Wilson barked, jabbing the sleeping man with his baton. The elderly man, who would later be identified as Thomas Chen, startled awake, his weathered face etched with confusion and fear. "This isn't a hotel. You can't sleep here." "I'm sorry, officer," Thomas stammered, quickly gathering his belongings. "I'll move along right away." His hands trembled as he reached for his photos, but Wilson was already grabbing his possessions. "Too slow," Wilson sneered, and in a moment of cruel impulsivity, he began tossing Thomas's carefully preserved belongings into a nearby puddle. The plastic folder split open, sending precious family photographs floating in the muddy water. "Please, no!" Thomas cried out, his voice breaking. "Those are the only pictures I have of my wife. Please." But Wilson wasn't finished. He kicked the soaked backpack away, scattering its meager contents across the wet grass. A small box tumbled out, spilling military medals onto the ground: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, service commendations from Vietnam. The commotion drew the attention of morning parkgoers. A young woman walking her dog stopped in shock, quickly pulling out her phone. A businessman on his way to work slowed his pace, witnessing the scene with growing dismay. An elderly couple on their morning walk stood frozen, the woman's hand covering her mouth in horror. Thomas remained on his knees, desperately trying to salvage his waterlogged photographs, his hands shaking as he pulled them from the puddle. His military jacket, worn but previously clean and dignified, was now splattered with mud as he scrambled to save what he could. "When I come back in 5 minutes, you better be gone," Wilson threatened, turning away from the devastation he'd caused. He walked a few paces, then looked back with a smirk. "And don't let me catch you in this park again." What Officer Wilson failed to notice was the growing crowd of witnesses. The young woman with the dog had been recording the entire incident. The businessman had already pulled out his phone and was dialing the police department's internal affairs division. The elderly couple had been joined by other morning walkers, all watching in stunned silence as this abuse of power unfolded before them. Thomas slowly gathered what remained of his possessions, his movements careful and deliberate despite his trembling hands. A small group of onlookers approached him, offering help and words of comfort, but he seemed lost in a daze of shock and grief. "I just wanted a safe place to sleep," he whispered, holding the dripping remains of his wife's photograph. "I never meant to cause any trouble." The young woman who had recorded the incident knelt beside him, helping to gather the scattered medals. She noticed the name on his military ID, still miraculously legible despite the water damage. A quick search on her phone confirmed what she suspected. Thomas Chen was no ordinary homeless veteran. He had served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned multiple commendations for bravery, and had lost everything recently due to mounting medical bills after his wife's battle with cancer. As Wilson disappeared around the corner, satisfied with his morning's work, he remained unaware that his next 10 minutes would change everything. The wheels of justice were already turning, powered by the outraged witnesses and their evidence. His moment of cruelty would soon become the biggest mistake of his career, and Thomas Chen's story would touch hearts across the city in ways neither man could have imagined. What had started as a simple morning patrol was about to become a powerful reminder that compassion and justice still existed in the world, and that sometimes karma works faster than anyone expects. The next 10 minutes unfolded like a whirlwind of activity in Central Park. As Officer Wilson strutted away, Feeling proud of his actions, the gathered crowd sprang into action. The young woman who had recorded the incident, Lisa Thompson, was already uploading the video to social media. Her hands shook with anger as she typed out a brief description of what she'd just witnessed. Meanwhile, the businessman who had called Internal Affairs was speaking in hushed but urgent tones into his phone. "Yes, I'm watching one of your officers abuse a homeless veteran right now. No, this isn't a misunderstanding. I'm looking at the man's military medals scattered in the mud." Other witnesses weren't staying quiet either. An off-duty nurse had approached Thomas, helping him gather his soggy belongings while checking if he needed medical attention. A retired teacher offered him her umbrella and a clean handkerchief to dry his face. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything were now on their phones, calling local news stations. "The way that officer treated him, it's just not right," the retired teacher said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This could be anyone's father or grandfather. No human being deserves to be treated like this." Thomas sat quietly on a dry bench where the nurse had led him, still clutching his damaged photographs. His weathered hands carefully tried to separate the wet pages, but many of the images had already begun to blur. Each ruined photo seemed to take another piece of his heart. "That was our wedding day," he murmured, pointing to a badly water-damaged picture. "Nancy wore her mother's pearls. She was so beautiful." His voice cracked as he spoke about his late wife, and several of the gathered people wiped away tears. The video of Officer Wilson's cruelty was spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Local news stations were already picking up the story, and reporters were rushing to the park. What Wilson didn't realize was that his body camera had been recording the entire incident, providing even more damning evidence of his behavior. Back at the police station, Wilson's supervisor, Lieutenant Richards, was already receiving multiple calls about the incident. The first came from Internal Affairs, followed quickly by the police commissioner's office. The viral video had caught their attention, and the timestamp showed it had happened less than 10 minutes ago. "Get Wilson back to the station immediately," Lieutenant Richards barked into his radio. "And somebody get me the footage from his body camera." The police department's public relations team was scrambling to respond as the story exploded online. Comments and shares were multiplying by the thousands, with many people recognizing Thomas from his regular presence in the park. Local business owners spoke up about his unfailing politeness, how he never bothered anyone, and always cleaned up after himself. A local veterans group had already been alerted and was sending representatives to the park. They arrived to find Thomas surrounded by concerned citizens, each offering what help they could. One woman had run to a nearby cafe and returned with hot coffee and breakfast. Another had given him her son's clean sweatshirt to replace his muddy jacket. "Sir," said the veterans group representative, addressing Thomas with respect, "we're here to help. What happened to you today is unacceptable, and we're going to make sure something is done about it." Thomas looked up, his eyes wet with tears, but holding a glimmer of hope. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said softly. "I just want my wife's pictures back." The growing crowd's anger wasn't directed at the police department as a whole, but specifically at Wilson's inexcusable behavior. Many noted that other officers they knew were kind and professional, making Wilson's actions even more shocking in contrast. 10 minutes after Wilson's cruel act, his world was crumbling around him, though he didn't know it yet. His phone began buzzing with urgent messages from his supervisor ordering him back to the station immediately. As he checked the messages, he noticed people giving him cold stares, holding up their phones, some even pointing at him and whispering. The temperature seemed to drop around him as realization slowly dawned. His moment of cruelty, which he had thought would go unnoticed like so many others, had been captured and shared with the world. His chest tightened as he saw the growing crowd around Thomas, the news vans pulling up to the park entrance, and the police cars approaching with their lights flashing. In just 10 minutes, Officer Wilson's act of cruelty had transformed into a story of community unity and support. While he had intended to demonstrate his power over someone he saw as powerless, he had instead revealed his own weakness and sparked a movement of compassion that would continue to grow throughout the day. The morning sun now shone on a very different scene than it had just minutes before. Where there had been cruelty, there was now kindness. Where there had been loneliness, there was now community. And where there had been injustice, the swift wheels of accountability were already turning. As the morning progressed, the true story of Thomas Chen began to emerge, adding deeper layers to the incident that had shocked the community. Lisa Thompson, the young woman who had first recorded the incident, had started doing some quick research on her phone. What she discovered made Officer Wilson's actions even more heartbreaking. Thomas had been a respected high school history teacher for over 30 years before everything fell apart. His wife Nancy's battle with cancer had drained their savings and then some. The medical bills kept piling up, and even after selling their modest home and car, it wasn't enough. After Nancy's passing 6 months ago, Thomas found himself unable to keep up with rent on his pension alone. "I never thought I'd end up here," Thomas explained quietly to the gathered supporters. "Nancy and I had plans for our retirement. We were going to travel, see our grandchildren more often." He paused, touching the soggy photograph of their wedding day. Life just had other plans. The local news crews had arrived in full force, but they were keeping a respectful distance, sensing that this story needed to be handled with care. One reporter, Helen Martinez, approached the group with genuine concern rather than just looking for a sensational story. "Mr. Chen," she said gently, "would you be willing to share your story with our viewers? People need to understand that homelessness can happen to anyone, even our community's heroes." Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If it helps prevent this from happening to someone else, I'll talk." As Thomas spoke with Helen, more details of his life came to light. He had served as a combat medic in Vietnam, saving countless lives under heavy fire. His Bronze Star and Purple Heart weren't just medals, they represented moments of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. After the war, he had dedicated his life to teaching, inspiring generations of students to understand history and respect veterans. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Wilson was facing the consequences of his actions. The bodycam footage was even more damning than the viral video. It had captured every cruel word, every deliberate act of destruction, and most importantly, his laughter as he walked away from the scene. Lieutenant Richards sat across from Wilson in the interview room, the footage playing on a screen between them. "Can't you explain this?" Richards asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was breaking the park rules, no sleeping on benches. "Stop," Richards cut him off. "We both know this isn't about park rules. This is about you abusing your authority to humiliate a man who served his country with honor. A man who taught kids in this community for 3 decades. A man who lost everything taking care of his dying wife." Back at the park, the community's response was growing by the minute. A local hotel owner had approached Thomas, offering him a room free of charge until a permanent solution could be found. A professional photographer had volunteered to restore any damaged photos that could be saved, and others offered to help track down copies of pictures from Thomas's former students and colleagues. The veterans group had set up a temporary command center of sorts, coordinating offers of help and ensuring Thomas wouldn't have to navigate this sudden attention alone. They'd already arranged for him to meet with a pro bono lawyer to discuss his rights and the possibility of legal action against Officer Wilson. "The thing that hurts the most," Thomas shared with Helen during their interview, "isn't losing my possessions. It's the way he laughed. Like my life, my service, my memories meant nothing." His words, spoken without bitterness but with deep sadness, resonated with viewers when the interview aired later that day. The story was quickly spreading beyond local news. National veterans organizations were picking it up, and social media was ablaze with calls for justice. But something else was happening too. People were sharing their own stories of hardship, of how quickly life can change, of how important it is to treat everyone with dignity. A former student of Thomas's from the 1990s had seen the news and immediately recognized his old teacher. He organized an online fundraiser that was growing by thousands of dollars every hour. More former students were coming forward, sharing stories of how Mr. Chen had changed their lives, helped them through tough times, or inspired them to serve their country. "He was more than just a teacher," one former student wrote online. "He showed us what real courage and compassion look like. He taught us that history isn't just dates in a book. It's about understanding human dignity and standing up for what's right." As the morning turned to afternoon, Thomas found himself surrounded by a different kind of family, one formed not by blood, but by compassion and shared humanity. The same park bench where he had faced cruelty just hours before had become a symbol of community strength and unity. What Officer Wilson had failed to understand that morning was that every person has a story, every life has value, and acts of cruelty don't just hurt one person, they tear at the fabric of our entire community. But in responding to that cruelty with overwhelming kindness, the community was weaving that fabric stronger than ever. As the afternoon sun hung high over the park, the story of Thomas Chen and Officer Wilson's cruel act had transformed into something much bigger than a single incident of police misconduct. The truth about Thomas's life continued to unfold, touching hearts and opening eyes across the community. A local historian who'd been following the story made a remarkable discovery. During his research, he found that Thomas had been more than just a combat medic. He had risked his life during a particularly fierce battle to save an entire platoon. The citation for his Bronze Star told of how he'd crawl through heavy enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers, using his own body as a shield to protect them while providing medical care. The thing is, the historian explained to the gathered reporters, Mr. Chen never talked about this. He kept these medals not for glory, but as reminders of the friends he'd lost and the lives he'd saved. The police department's Internal Affairs Division was working at unprecedented speed. They'd set up a temporary office in a conference room, walls covered with witness statements, screenshots of social media posts, and transcripts from Wilson's body camera footage. The evidence was overwhelming. In all my years handling internal affairs cases, said the lead investigator, I've never seen such a clear-cut example of abuse of power combined with such a complete lack of remorse. Meanwhile, Thomas's former students had organized an impromptu reunion at the park. They came from all walks of life: doctors, teachers, military service members, business owners. Each carried a story about how Mr. Chen had influenced their lives. One former student, now a successful business owner, stood up to share his story. I was struggling in school, ready to drop out. Mr. Chen stayed after class every day for 3 months, not just helping me with history, but teaching me about life. He showed me that my past didn't have to define my future. The online fundraiser had exploded, reaching 6 figures by mid-afternoon. But more than money, people were offering what they could. A local real estate agent pledged to help find Thomas affordable housing. A dentist offered free dental care. A car dealership promised to provide him with reliable transportation. But perhaps the most touching offer came from a small photo restoration studio. The owner, an elderly man who'd also served in Vietnam, had seen the news and immediately recognized the type of photographs Thomas had lost, the same kind he kept of his own wife. These aren't just pictures, the studio owner explained as he carefully examined the water-damaged photos. They're anchors to our past, windows to our happiest moments. I promise you, Mr. Chen, we'll save as many of these memories as we can. At the police station, Officer Wilson's situation was growing more serious by the hour. The police union representative assigned to his case sat across from him, shaking his head after reviewing the evidence. I'll be honest with you, the representative said, this isn't something we can defend. Your actions weren't just against department policy, they were against everything the badge stands for. Wilson sat in silence, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. The smirk he'd worn earlier was long gone, replaced by a look of growing realization. His career, built over 12 years, was crumbling because of 10 minutes of cruelty. Back at the park, Thomas was sharing more of his story with Helen, the compassionate reporter who'd first interviewed him. He spoke about his years of teaching, about the joy of seeing students grasp complex historical events, about making history come alive in his classroom. I'd always taught my students that history isn't just about memorizing dates, he explained, his eyes brightening as he spoke about teaching. It's about understanding how people face challenges, how communities come together in times of crisis, how small acts of kindness or cruelty can change the course of lives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. His words perfectly described what was happening now as the community rallied around him. A group of local veterans had started a WASH program in the park, ensuring that no one else would face the kind of treatment Thomas had endured. They weren't there to police, but to protect and support those in need. What happened to Thomas could have happened to any of us, one veteran explained. We all face battles in life. Sometimes the wounds are visible, sometimes they're hidden. But no one should face those battles alone. As the afternoon wore on, the story continued to evolve. It was no longer just about one officer's cruel act or one man's struggle. It had become a testament to the power of community, a reminder that beneath our differences and despite our challenges, human dignity and compassion could still prevail. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police department's conference room as the disciplinary hearing for Officer Wilson began. The room was packed with officials, witnesses, and representatives from various community organizations. The tension in the air was palpable as Police Chief Anderson called the hearing to order. Today, we're here to address one of the most serious breaches of public trust I've seen in my 30 years of service, the chief began, his voice steady but heavy with disappointment. The evidence we're about to review isn't just about breaking department policy, it's about breaking the fundamental trust between law enforcement and the community we serve. The department's internal affairs team presented their findings methodically. They played the body camera footage showing every moment of Wilson's cruel actions. The room fell silent as they watched Thomas Chen's possessions being deliberately destroyed, heard Wilson's mocking laughter, saw the heartbreak in Thomas's eyes as he tried to save his wife's photographs. What makes this case particularly disturbing, the lead investigator explained, is the clear premeditation. Officer Wilson had encountered Mr. Chen before. There were no complaints about Mr. Chen's behavior, no calls from citizens, no violations that warranted intervention. While the hearing proceeded, Thomas was experiencing a very different kind of afternoon. The local hotel where he'd been offered temporary housing had become a hub of community support. The lobby was filled with people bringing clothes, books, and other necessities. But more importantly, they brought stories and friendship. A group of teachers from his old school had arrived with yearbooks spanning his 30-year career. Each page held memories of lives he'd touched, students he'd guided, moments he'd shaped. They had also brought something even more precious, a photo album they'd saved from his classroom when he'd retired. "We kept this when the school was renovating," one of his former colleagues explained, handling the album carefully. "It was full of pictures from your classroom over the years. We thought you might want it someday." Thomas opened the album with trembling hands. There, preserved in perfect condition, were dozens of photographs, including several copies of pictures he thought he'd lost forever. Among them was a duplicate of his wedding photo, slightly faded but intact. Back at the police station, Wilson sat stone-faced as witness after witness testified about what they'd seen in the park. The young woman who'd recorded the video described how Wilson had laughed while destroying Thomas's possessions. The businessman spoke about Wilson's aggressive behavior and complete disregard for human dignity. But it was the testimony of a fellow officer that seemed to hit Wilson the hardest. Officer Chen, no relation to Thomas, had worked with Wilson for 5 years. "We're taught to protect and serve," Officer Chen stated firmly. "What I saw in that video wasn't protection or service, it was bullying, it was cruelty, and it goes against everything that badge represents." The disciplinary board took less than an hour to reach their decision. Wilson's actions violated multiple department policies, but more than that, they violated the basic principles of human decency and professional conduct. Meanwhile, the community's response continued to grow. Local businesses had joined forces to create a support network for homeless veterans in the area. The hotel owner who'd offered Thomas a room had expanded his offer to include other veterans in need of temporary housing. A local law firm had stepped forward to help Thomas navigate the complex system of veterans' benefits he was entitled to but had struggled to access. They discovered he qualified for several programs that could provide stable housing and regular income. "The system can be overwhelming," the lead attorney explained. "Sometimes people just need someone to guide them through the process. That's what community is about, helping each other navigate difficult times." The photo restoration expert had made remarkable progress with Thomas's damaged photographs. Using specialized techniques and digital technology, he'd managed to save many of the images that seemed beyond repair. Each restored photo brought back a piece of Thomas's past, a fragment of his life with Nancy. "Pictures tell our stories," the restoration expert said, carefully handling a restored photo of Thomas and Nancy at their favorite park bench, Ironically, the same bench where Wilson had found Thomas that morning. They keep our memories alive. That's why what happened this morning was more than just property damage, it was an attempt to erase someone's history. As the day progressed, the story continued to resonate beyond the local community. National news outlets had picked up the story, not focusing on the negative aspects, but highlighting the community's extraordinary response to cruelty. What happened in our park today shows both the worst and the best of humanity, Helen, the local reporter, said in her evening news report. One man's cruel act revealed the compassion of an entire community. It reminded us that we're all connected, all vulnerable, and all capable of making a difference in each other's lives. As evening approached, the police department's conference room had emptied except for Chief Anderson and Lieutenant Richards. They sat reviewing the final paperwork from Wilson's disciplinary hearing, their faces showing the weight of the day's events. Effective immediately, Chief Anderson read from the official document, Officer Robert Wilson's employment with this department is terminated. His actions today demonstrate a complete failure to uphold the values and standards we represent. The decision wasn't just about one incident. A deeper investigation had revealed a pattern of similar behavior that had gone unreported. Other homeless individuals had suffered similar treatment from Wilson, but fear and hopelessness had kept them silent. We failed them too, Lieutenant Richards said quietly, looking at the stack of newly discovered complaints. We should have seen the signs sooner. Across town, the hotel lobby where Thomas was staying had become a gathering place for community members. The initial shock and anger of the morning had transformed into something more powerful, a movement for lasting change. A group of local business owners had formed a coalition to address homelessness in their community. They weren't just offering temporary solutions, they were creating a comprehensive program to help people rebuild their lives. What happened to Mr. Chen opened our eyes, explained the hotel owner who'd first offered Thomas a room. We realized we walk past people every day without seeing their stories, their struggles, their humanity. That stops now. The Veterans Organization had set up a permanent outreach program in the park. They brought in counselors, job placement specialists, and housing experts. Their goal wasn't just to help Thomas, it was to ensure no other veteran would have to sleep on a park bench again. Thomas sat in a comfortable chair in the hotel's quiet corner, surrounded by restored photographs and new friends. The photo restoration expert had worked miracles with the water-damaged pictures, bringing back memories Thomas thought were lost forever. Look at this one, Thomas said softly, holding up a restored photo of Nancy in their garden. She loved those roses. Every spring, she'd spend hours out there, talking to them like they were old friends. His eyes glistened with tears, but his smile was genuine. The online fundraiser had exceeded all expectations, reaching nearly $500,000. But more important than the money were the messages people left with their donations. Each one told a story. Of former students whose lives Thomas had touched, of veterans who understood his struggle, of community members who wanted to make things right. One message stood out, Mr. Chen taught me history in 1985. When my father died, he stayed after school every day for weeks, just talking with me, helping me process my grief. He taught me that kindness matters more than any lesson in a textbook. Today, I get to return that kindness. The police department had announced major changes to their training programs. Every officer would now receive extensive training on handling situations involving homeless individuals and veterans. They were partnering with social workers and mental health professionals to create a more compassionate approach. We wear this badge to protect and serve everyone in our community, Chief Anderson announced at the evening press conference. Today reminded us that service requires compassion, understanding, and respect for human dignity. As night fell, Thomas stood at his hotel room window, looking out at the city lights. The same park where he'd faced such cruelty in the morning was now visible in the distance, transformed into a symbol of hope and community strength. Nancy would have loved this, he whispered to himself, touching the restored wedding photo he now kept close to his heart. She always said that people are basically good, that kindness wins in the end. Today proved she was right. The day's events had sparked something larger than anyone expected. Local news stations were reporting that other communities were starting similar programs, inspired by how this city had responded to cruelty with compassion. Sometimes it takes a dark moment to show us the light in people's hearts, Helen, the reporter, concluded in her evening broadcast. Today, one man's cruel act revealed the extraordinary capacity for kindness that exists in our community. The question now is, how will we keep this momentum going? 1 month after the incident that changed everything, the park looked different. Where there had once been just a weathered bench, there now stood a small building with a sign reading Community Support Center. It was early morning, and Thomas Chen stood at its entrance, no longer as someone seeking help, but as someone offering it. "Welcome," he said warmly to a young veteran who had just walked in. "Would you like some coffee?" His gentle voice and understanding smile made the nervous young man relax immediately. The center had become a safe haven for veterans and homeless individuals, providing everything from hot meals to job training. The changes in the community went far beyond this one building. The police department had completely revamped its training program, with Thomas himself serving as a consultant. Every new officer now spent time at the center, learning to see beyond badges and circumstances to the human stories beneath. "It's not about enforcing rules," Thomas explained to a group of police cadets during their training session. "It's about understanding that every person you meet has a story, has value, has dignity. That's the lesson I learned from my students over 30 years of teaching, and it's the lesson this community taught me again when I needed it most." Former Officer Wilson's story had taken an unexpected turn. After his termination, he'd gone through a period of deep reflection. One morning, he showed up at the center, not seeking forgiveness, but offering to help. He now volunteered regularly, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of losing sight of humanity. "I thought I was enforcing the law," Wilson told a community group, "but I was just being cruel because I could be. Watching how this community responded to my cruelty, that changed me. It showed me what real strength looks like." The fundraiser money had been turned into a foundation, providing support for homeless veterans across the city. Thomas insisted that most of it go to helping others, accepting only enough to secure modest housing for himself. His apartment walls were now covered with restored photographs, memories of Nancy alongside new pictures of the community that had become his family. Local businesses had created a network of support, offering job training and employment opportunities. The hotel that had first given Thomas shelter now had a permanent program for veterans in transition, helping them bridge the gap between homelessness and stability. "We're not just providing rooms," the hotel owner explained. "We're providing a chance for people to rebuild their lives with dignity." The photo restoration expert had turned his one-time act of kindness into a regular service, helping others recover and preserve their precious memories. His small studio had become a place where people brought not just damaged photographs, but their stories and hopes. "Every picture we save is more than just paper and ink," he'd say. "It's someone's history, someone's heart." The park bench where everything had started remained, but now bore a small plaque. On this spot, cruelty was transformed into compassion. May we never forget that kindness is the strongest force in our community. Thomas's former students had organized regular gatherings at the center, bringing their own children to learn from their beloved teacher once again. But now the lessons weren't about historical dates and events. They were about humanity, compassion, and the power of community. 1 year to the day after the incident, the city held a celebration in the park, not to remember the cruelty of that morning, but to celebrate what had grown from it. People from all walks of life gathered to share stories, food, and friendship. "Look at all this," Thomas said to Helen, the reporter who had covered his story from the beginning. "Nancy always said that good grows where you plant it. This community planted kindness, and look what bloomed." The celebration wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. New programs were being announced, more communities were adopting similar models, and the ripples of positive change continued to spread. As the sun set on the celebration, Thomas stood near his old bench, now surrounded by flowers and friendship instead of loneliness and fear. In his hand, he held the restored photograph of his wedding day, Nancy's smile as bright as ever. "We did it, my love," he whispered to her picture. "We found our way home again, just in a different way than we expected." The story of Thomas Chen and that cruel morning had become more than just a tale of injustice overcome. It had become a reminder that in every community there exists the potential for extraordinary kindness, and that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest transformations. The end of one story, Thomas often told visitors to the center, is just the beginning of another. And in this community, we're writing that story together, one act of kindness at a time.